A misjudgment in the spotlight. Naomi Barnes sat at her table in the upscale restaurant, her posture perfect, her back straight, and her gaze steady. The glittering chandeliers above bathed the room in soft light, casting shadows over the white tablecloths and polished silverware. This was not her first time in such a luxurious establishment, but tonight the atmosphere felt different. She could feel eyes on her, lingering, assessing, perhaps even judging. Being the only black woman in a sea of affluent diners, she was no stranger to the undercurrent of silent stares that questioned her presence. She wasn't here for pleasure, though the elegance of the restaurant might suggest otherwise. Naomi, a highly trained FBI agent, was on assignment. Her target, Marcus Weller, a smooth-talking businessman with deep connections to organized crime, had just arrived. Her years of undercover work had led her to this moment, but something in the air felt off. Weller sat across the room, exuding charm as he entertained his guests, unaware of Naomi's real identity. But Naomi wasn't fully focused on him. Her instincts, honed by years of experience, whispered that something else was about to unfold, something unplanned. Naomi's fingers grazed the bracelet on her wrist, an innocuous-looking piece of jewelry that concealed a discreet recording device. She scanned the room, careful not to raise suspicion, but as she glanced toward the entrance, she froze. A police officer had entered the restaurant, his uniform stark against the backdrop of elegance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated an aura of authority that didn't sit right with Naomi. Officer Jake Peters walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the room before they landed squarely on Naomi. She knew that look, disdain mixed with an undercurrent of judgment, as though her mere presence was an offense. He wasn't here for a routine check. Naomi had dealt with officers like Peters before, men who saw a black woman and immediately assumed she didn't belong. Peters approached her table, his hand resting casually on the belt where his gun and cuffs were strapped. His walk slow, deliberate, as though savoring the attention he was drawing. The conversation in the restaurant died down, replaced by murmurs of curiosity. Naomi's heart raced, but her face remained calm. She had to maintain control. "Evening, ma'am," Peters said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, though tinged with condescension. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Naomi felt a knot tighten in her stomach, not from fear, but from the frustration of knowing exactly where this was headed. She was used to blending into the background, but tonight she was the focus of unwanted attention. She remained poised, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a reason for this, officer?" "You don't belong here," Peters replied bluntly, his tone colder now. "We've had complaints about someone matching your description, causing a disturbance." Naomi knew what that meant. Her presence, her blackness, was the disturbance. She took a deep breath, weighing her options. She couldn't let this escalate, but neither could she afford to lose her dignity. Slowly, she reached into her purse, her fingers brushing the edge of her badge, but she stopped short. Revealing herself as an FBI agent at this point would only complicate her mission. She pulled out her driver's license instead. Peters took it, barely glancing at the details before tossing it back at her. His eyes narrowed. "What are you really doing here?" Naomi's jaw tightened. The humiliation of being reduced to a suspect simply because of her race stung, but she had faced worse. "I'm here for dinner," she said, her voice steady. "That's not a crime, is it?" Peter's eyes flashed with irritation. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like her. He glanced around, noticing the eyes of the other patrons on him, waiting for his next move. Without warning, he grabbed Naomi's arm, pulling her up from her seat. "You're coming with me for questioning," he barked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room fell into a stunned silence. Naomi's heart raced. This was spiraling out of control faster than she had anticipated. Her mind scrambled for a way to de-escalate the situation, but before she could speak, Peters slapped handcuffs around her wrists with unnecessary force. "Officer, this is a mistake," Naomi said, her voice still measured, though the anger bubbled beneath the surface. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, could hear the whispers growing louder. Peters wasn't just humiliating her, he was making a spectacle of her, and that infuriated her more than anything else. "Maybe you should have thought about that before causing a scene," Peters replied smugly, gripping her arm tightly as he began to escort her toward the exit. Naomi's heart pounded. Her mind raced with calculations. This was no longer about the mission. This was about dignity, about standing up against an injustice she had faced her entire life. And yet she couldn't reveal her true identity here. Not yet. As they neared the exit, Naomi glanced back at Weller. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, but she could see a flicker of confusion in his eyes. She had been so close to nailing him, but now, because of Peters, everything was falling apart. Naomi clenched her fists, the metal of the cuffs biting into her skin. Outside, the cold night air hit her like a slap. Peters shoved her toward the waiting squad car, and as she stumbled slightly, she made a decision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Peters opened the door to the back seat, Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made him pause. "You have no idea who I am, officer, but you will." Peters scoffed, but Naomi's words had unsettled him, even if he didn't show it. She had dealt with men like him her whole life, men who thought their authority was absolute, men who believed that people like her didn't belong in spaces of power. But this time, Peters had miscalculated, and Naomi was about to make sure he knew just how badly he had messed up. The reckoning begins. Naomi sat in the back of the squad car, her wrists still bound by the cold metal of the handcuffs, her mind running through 1,000 scenarios. The city lights flickered past as Officer Peters drove in silence, his smug demeanor palpable even from where she sat. He thought he had won. He thought he put her in her place. Little did he know that everything was about to change. In the passenger seat, Officer Richards occasionally glanced at Naomi in the rearview mirror, but his eyes betrayed a hint of unease. Unlike Peters, Richards wasn't entirely comfortable with what had just transpired. Naomi could tell. He shifted in his seat, drumming his fingers on his leg, his body language screaming hesitation. Naomi's breathing steadied as she thought about her next move. Revealing her FBI credentials now would certainly end this nightmare, but it would also ruin her mission. Weller was still in that restaurant, and if word got back to him that an FBI agent had been arrested, her months of painstaking undercover work would be for nothing. But there was something else, something deeper that held Naomi back from revealing herself. This was more than just a mission now. This was about standing up to the systemic abuse of power she had endured her entire life. She needed to take control of the situation, but carefully, strategically. "Richards," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence of the car. Peters glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but she ignored him, keeping her eyes locked on Richards. The younger officer shifted in his seat, clearly startled that she had addressed him directly. "Yeah," he muttered, not looking back at her. "You know this is wrong," Naomi continued, her voice calm but firm. "You know I didn't do anything, and that this is nothing more than racial profiling. You're going to let him throw away your career over a power trip." Richard's jaw tightened. He glanced sideways at Peters, who shot him a warning glare. The tension in the car grew thick, but Naomi wasn't done. "You're complicit," Naomi said, her words calculated to hit where they would hurt. "Every second you stay silent, you're telling the world that this is okay, that this kind of abuse of authority is fine with you." "Shut up," Peters snapped from the driver's seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "You're in no position to be making demands." Naomi leaned back against the seat, a small smile forming at the edge of her lips. Peters was getting rattled, and that was exactly what she needed. He was the type who thrived on control, and she was slowly unraveling that control. "Officer Peters," Naomi said, her voice cool, "you really think this is going to end well for you?" Peters sneered, but Naomi could see the flash of uncertainty in his eyes. "You're the one in cuffs," he said. "Not me." Naomi nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "For now," she replied. "But I want you to remember this moment. Remember everything you've said and done tonight. Because soon, you're going to be on the other side of those cuffs, and I promise you, this night will haunt you for the rest of your career." Richard's eyes widened slightly, and even Peter's hesitated for a second. The power in Naomi's voice wasn't just confidence. It was a quiet, unshakable certainty that made even Peters question himself. But his ego wouldn't allow him to back down. Not yet. The car came to a stop outside a small, dimly lit precinct on the outskirts of the city. Peters yanked the door open and pulled Naomi out roughly by her arm. The cold air bit at her skin as she was led inside, but Naomi's expression never wavered. She had been in tougher situations than this, and she knew how to play the long game. The precinct was nearly empty, the low hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. Peters led her to a holding cell, pushing her inside without a word. The door clanged shut, and the sound echoed through the small space, but Naomi remained composed. She sat down on the narrow bench, crossing her legs and taking a deep breath. This was far from over. Peters lingered outside the cell for a moment, watching her with a smug grin. "I hope you're comfortable," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You'll be here for a while." Naomi met his gaze, her eyes sharp and unflinching. "We'll see about that." With that, Peters turned and walked away, leaving Naomi alone in the cold, sterile cell. The sound of his footsteps faded, and Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. She needed to be patient. Timing was everything. As the minutes ticked by, Naomi's mind shifted gears. She had to find a way to contact her team without blowing her cover, and she had just the plan. Reaching for the bracelet on her wrist, she pressed a hidden button, activating the device's emergency beacon. The signal would alert her team that she was in trouble, but it wouldn't give away her exact location just yet. She still had time to maneuver. An hour passed, maybe more, before she heard footsteps approaching again. This time, it was Richards alone. He hesitated outside the cell, clearly uncomfortable. Naomi looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. Richards shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what you mean," he mumbled, though his tone lacked conviction. "Yes, you do," Naomi replied, her voice soft but firm. "You know exactly what this is about. Peters is on a power trip, and you're just going along with it. But here's the thing. You're better than this. I can see it." Richards glanced down at the ground, his face tightening with frustration. For a moment, Naomi thought he might walk away, but then he sighed heavily and looked back at her. "I didn't sign up for this," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't sign up to harass innocent people just because of how they look." "Then do something about it," Naomi said, standing up and stepping toward the bars. "You have a choice right now, Officer Richards. You can let this happen, or you can stop it. But either way, you're going to have to live with the consequences." Richards swallowed hard, the internal conflict evident on his face. He glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to make sure Peters wasn't nearby, and then he stepped closer to the cell. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi smiled slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "Someone who's going to make sure Peters never pulls this stunt again. But I need your help." Richards hesitated, but the seed had been planted. Naomi could see it in his eyes. He was on the verge of breaking away from Peters' toxic influence. She just needed to push him a little further. "You know this isn't right," Naomi continued. "You know that what he's doing is dangerous, not just for me, but for you too. If you go down this path with him, it's going to ruin you. But if you help me, we can stop him before it's too late." Richards glanced around nervously again, but then, with a resigned sigh, he pulled out his keys and unlocked the cell. "You're making a huge mistake," he muttered, but Naomi knew he wasn't talking about her. He was talking about Peters. And now, The tide was beginning to turn, shattering the illusion of power. The moment the cell door creaked open, Naomi stepped out with deliberate calm, her gaze steady on Officer Richards. He was sweating, his face tense with doubt and fear. This was his turning point, and Naomi knew she had to guide him carefully, but decisively. The wrong move now could ruin everything. Richards stepped back, nervously glancing toward the front of the precinct where Officer Peters was likely still basking in his self-assured sense of victory. "We don't have much time before he notices something's off," Richards muttered, his voice low. Naomi nodded, taking in the layout of the small precinct. "We don't need much time," she replied, her voice measured. "But you need to listen to me, and you need to trust that I know what I'm doing." Richards looked at her, doubt clouding his eyes, but deep inside, she could see the spark of a man who wanted to do the right thing. "I could lose everything if this goes wrong," he said, the weight of his own fear sinking in. "If you don't act now, you'll lose more than your job," Naomi replied, her voice dropping an octave. "You'll lose yourself. Do you really want to be the officer who stood by while an innocent woman was harassed and humiliated? This is your chance to step away from that." The silence between them hung in the air like a heavy fog. Richard's eyes darted between the narrow hallway that led to Peters and the door leading to the outside world, as if calculating his escape. Naomi needed to keep him focused. "I need you to help me get my phone and my belongings from Peters," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Once I have them, I'll call my team, and this will all be over. But I can't do it alone." Richards bit his lip, his fingers twitching near his holster, as though tempted to pull the gun for reassurance. But he nodded slowly. "What are you?" he asked in a low voice. "You're not just a regular person." Naomi took a breath. The time for half-truths was over. "I'm an FBI agent," she said, her voice unwavering. "And if Peters keeps pushing this, he's not just going to lose his badge. He's going to end up in a federal prison for obstruction of justice, racial profiling, and unlawful arrest. But we can stop this now if you help me." The words hung between them like a challenge. Richard's eyes widened in shock, and he took a half-step back, as if suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. Naomi could see his mind working, weighing the risks against the rewards. "FBI," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling slightly. He looked down at her wrists, still marked by the handcuffs' pressure. "And Peters, he really doesn't know." Naomi shook her head, her gaze steely. "No, and he doesn't need to find out until we're ready." Richards clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He had crossed a line by freeing her, and now he was standing at the edge of something much larger than he had ever imagined. "All right," he said, swallowing hard. "What do we do?" Naomi smiled faintly, appreciating the courage it took for Richards to stand with her now. "First," she said, "we need to find out where Peters put my things. My phone and credentials will shut this whole thing down in an instant. Once I have those, we'll deal with him." Richards nodded, leading Naomi quietly down the hallway toward the small room Peters had used earlier. The precinct was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Naomi could feel the tension crackling in the air, a current of impending conflict that had yet to explode. They reached the room, and Richards opened the door, revealing a cluttered office where Peters had carelessly dumped Naomi's purse, phone, and other belongings. Her heart leaped when she saw the phone, her lifeline. The moment she had it in her hands, the game would change. But just as Naomi moved to retrieve her things, the door swung open violently, slamming against the wall. Peters stood in the doorway, his face contorted with fury, his hand resting dangerously close to his gun. "What the hell is going on here?" Peters barked, his eyes darting between Naomi and Richards, as if trying to make sense of the betrayal unfolding before him. His face flushed red, the anger rolling off him in waves. Naomi could tell he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a fellow officer. Richards froze, his face drained of color, panic setting in as Peters took a menacing step forward. Naomi saw the fear flicker in his eyes and knew she had to act fast. "Richards," Peters growled, his voice low and menacing. "You better have a damn good explanation for this. Are you seriously going to let this?" "That's enough, Peters," Naomi cut him off, her voice like steel. She stood tall, stepping between Richards and Peters, facing the officer head-on. She wasn't afraid anymore. This man had held power over her for long enough, and now it was time to dismantle it. Peters sneered, looking her up and down with barely concealed contempt. "You think you can give me orders, huh? Lady, you're in no position to be making demands." Naomi's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Actually, I am." She pulled her hand slowly from her side and flashed her FBI badge with a flick of her wrist, her gaze never leaving his. The badge gleamed in the dim light, and for the first time that night, Peters hesitated. His expression shifted from anger to confusion, then to disbelief. "Your FBI." He sputtered, taking a step back, as though the badge were some kind of weapon. Naomi nodded slowly, her voice calm but authoritative. "Special Agent Naomi Barnes, FBI. And you, Officer Peters, have just committed a serious crime. You unlawfully detained a federal agent, racially profiled me in front of a room full of witnesses, and attempted to derail a federal investigation." Peters' face drained of color, the blood rushing from his cheeks as the weight of her words settled in. He stumbled over his words, trying to backtrack. "I didn't know. I was just..." But Naomi wasn't finished. "Do you know what the penalties are for obstructing a federal investigation? For racial profiling? This precinct is about to have more attention on it than it has ever seen, and you'll be lucky if you still have a badge by the end of the week." Richard stood frozen, caught between his loyalty to his partner and the realization that he had just helped save his own career. Peters, however, was a different story. His hand twitched near his gun, but Naomi's stare stopped him cold. "Don't even think about it," she said sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This ends now." Peters opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. The humiliation, the fear, and the realization of his downfall had rendered him speechless. He took a slow step back, his confidence crumbling with each passing second. Naomi moved swiftly, picking up her phone from the desk and dialing her supervisor, Agent Clark. Her team had been monitoring the situation, and with one call, backup would be on its way. The precinct would be crawling with federal agents soon enough, and Peters would be facing the consequences of his actions. As the phone rang, Naomi met Peters' gaze one last time. "You think you're in control because of your badge," she said quietly, "but real power comes from doing what's right, not from abusing your authority. You've been using your position to hurt people for too long, but tonight it ends." The phone clicked, and Agent Clark's voice came through the line. "Barnes, is everything all right?" Naomi's eyes never left Peters as she spoke. "We're going to need a team down here, immediately. We have a problem." Peters stared at her, the last remnants of his bravado slipping away. He was finished, and he knew it. The fall of a tyrant. The air in the small precinct felt heavier as Naomi stood her ground, the phone still in her hand. The weight of the coming storm hung in the atmosphere, thick with tension. Officer Peters, once brimming with self-importance, now stood frozen in disbelief. His hand twitched at his side, a mixture of fury and fear flashing in his eyes. The reality of what was happening seemed to crash down on him all at once. Naomi, calm and composed, ended the call with her superior and slid the phone into her pocket, her gaze never leaving Peters. She could sense the rage simmering just beneath his surface, the struggle for control evident in his clenched fists and flared nostrils. Richards, still standing in the background, looked as if he were caught in a nightmare. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He glanced nervously between Naomi and Peters, unsure of where he fit in this escalating conflict. The room was a powder keg, and Naomi knew it was only a matter of time before it blew. Peters finally found his voice, though it was strained, his usual bravado all but gone. "You think you can just walk in here and pull rank on me because you've got a fancy badge?" He spat, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. "You don't know how things work around here." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her calmness unnerving him further. "I know exactly how things work around here, Officer Peters," she said, her voice low and steady. "And that's the problem. You've been running this precinct like your own personal fiefdom, using your badge to bully and intimidate people who don't fit into your narrow worldview. But that ends now." Peters sneered, taking a step forward, his face contorted with rage. "You don't belong here," he hissed. "This is my precinct. I've been keeping order in this city for years. People respect me, fear me, and I won't let some outsider come in and—" "Abuse of power," Naomi interrupted, her voice cutting through his rant like a knife. "That's what this is. You use your position not to protect or serve, but to terrorize anyone who doesn't look like you. This isn't about order, Peters. It's about control. And you're about to lose it all." Peters' face turned red, his temper finally snapping. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you? Just because you wear that badge," he growled, his voice rising. He reached for his gun, his hand trembling as he gripped the handle. Naomi didn't flinch. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to still. The tension was so thick that even Richards took a step back, sensing the danger in the air. "Think carefully, Peters," Naomi said, her voice firm but not raised. "You pull that trigger, and there's no going back. You're not just losing your badge, you're losing your freedom. One more step, and this becomes more than just a career-ending mistake. You'll be facing federal charges, and trust me, the Bureau doesn't take kindly to cops who cross that line." Peters hesitated, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He knew she was right. He wasn't stupid, and despite his arrogance, he understood that pulling his weapon on a federal agent would destroy any remnants of a future he thought he had. For a long, agonizing moment, it seemed as if he might actually go through with it. But then, with a guttural growl of frustration, he released his grip on the gun and stepped back, his chest heaving with the effort to control himself. "You'll regret this," he muttered, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "You'll regret the day you ever set foot in this precinct." Naomi stepped closer to him, her face inches from his, her eyes unflinching. "The only thing I regret, Peters, is that you've been allowed to get away with this for so long. But your time is up." The sound of sirens in the distance broke the silence. Peters' face drained of color as he realized what was coming. Backup. Naomi's team. The federal agents who would take over the situation and ensure that Peters was held accountable for everything he had done that night, and likely much more that would come to light in the investigation that would follow. Richards shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the door. The sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights spilling into the room through the narrow windows. He knew what was coming, and he was torn between loyalty to his partner and the truth that had been staring him in the face all night. The truth Naomi had forced him to confront. "You need to make a decision," Naomi said quietly, turning to Richards. "Are you going to stand by Peters and go down with him, or are you going to do the right thing?" Richards swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had followed Peters' lead for years, turning a blind eye to the way his partner treated people, ignoring the small abuses of power that had now grown into something monstrous. But Naomi's presence had shattered that comfortable ignorance. He could no longer pretend that he didn't see what was happening. And now he had to choose. The sound of tires screeching to a halt outside broke the silence. The doors of several cars opened and slammed shut, and the precinct was suddenly flooded with the sound of approaching footsteps. Naomi's backup had arrived. Richards looked at Naomi, his face full of conflict, and then he did something unexpected. He stepped forward, blocking Peter's path. "It's over," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "She's right, Peters. This has gone too far. You need to stop." Peters' eyes widened in disbelief. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising with panic. "You can't turn on me like this. We're partners." Richards shook his head, his face pale but resolute. "We were partners," he said quietly, "but I'm not going down with you." At that moment, the door to the precinct burst open, and a team of FBI agents poured in, their guns drawn, their faces grim. Agent Clark, Naomi's supervisor, was at the forefront, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on Naomi. Relief flickered in his gaze, but he didn't break stride. "Officer Peters," Clark said, his voice authoritative and cold. "You're under arrest for the unlawful detainment of a federal agent, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. Put your hands where I can see them." Peters, his face pale and his bravado completely shattered, looked around the room as if searching for a way out, but there was none. Slowly, he raised his hands, his face contorted with anger and humiliation. The agents moved in swiftly, cuffing him with the very handcuffs he had so arrogantly wielded not long ago. Naomi watched as Peters was led out of the precinct, his head bowed in defeat. It was over. The man who had tried to use his badge to intimidate and harass her was now facing the consequences of his actions. Richard stood off to the side, watching silently as his former partner was taken away. His face was a mixture of relief and sorrow, the weight of his choices settling on him. Naomi walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Richards nodded, though his face still bore the strain of what had just happened. I should have stopped him sooner," he said, his voice thick with regret. Naomi gave him a small, understanding smile. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said. "And now, because you did, you're not going down with him." Richards nodded again, but Naomi could see the conflict still simmering inside him. This wasn't an easy night for anyone, but it was a necessary one. Agent Clark approached Naomi, his expression one of relief, but also concern. "You all right?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "I'm fine. Just glad it's over." Clark sighed, glancing toward the door where Peters had been taken away. "This precinct is going to need a lot of cleaning up after what we uncovered tonight," he said. "Peters wasn't acting alone. We're going to find out just how deep this corruption goes." Naomi nodded, her mind already turning toward the next steps. There would be investigations, hearings, and likely more arrests before this was all over. But for now, justice had been served, and Peters had been taken down. As the night outside the precinct darkened, Naomi allowed herself a moment of quiet victory. She had faced down the abuse of power and won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been in her shoes. This battle was just the beginning, but it was a victory nonetheless, unveiling the deeper corruption. The sky outside the precinct was still dark as the FBI agents swarmed the building, securing evidence and interviewing the few remaining officers. The tension that had hung in the air for hours finally began to ease, though a sense of unease still lingered. Naomi stood outside, watching the flashes of red and blue light reflect off the nearby windows, her mind already moving toward the next phase of this operation. Officer Peters had been taken away, but his arrest was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Naomi knew this wasn't an isolated incident. Peters wasn't smart enough to have operated with impunity for this long without help. There were others, higher-ups in the precinct, in the city, maybe even further, who had allowed this abuse of power to continue unchecked. And now, it was time to bring them all to light. Naomi's thoughts were interrupted by the approach of Agent Clark, who stood beside her, his brow furrowed in concern. "We've got Peters in custody," he said, his voice low. "But this isn't over, Barnes. We need to go deeper." Naomi nodded, her eyes still scanning the precinct, watching as agents moved in and out, carrying boxes of files and computers. "I know," she replied, her voice calm but determined. Peters wasn't working alone. There's a system of protection around men like him. He's been allowed to get away with this for years because someone was covering for him. Clark crossed his arms, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. We're pulling every file we can from this place. Internal complaints, personnel records, any communication that might link Peters to other officers or officials. I've already flagged a few names that seem suspicious. Naomi turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. Who? Clark sighed, glancing down at the clipboard in his hand. For starters, the precinct's captain, John Marshall. His record is spotless, but that's part of the problem. It's too spotless. Not a single complaint filed against him, and we both know that's rare in this line of work. No officer, especially one in a leadership position, makes it through their career without some heat. Naomi nodded, the pieces falling into place. Captain Marshall had been Peters' superior for years. If Peters had been running wild, abusing his power without consequence, there was no way Marshall didn't know. He either turned a blind eye or was actively involved. And then there's the DA's office, Clark continued, flipping through a few more pages. I've seen some irregularities with how certain cases involving Peters were handled. Evidence going missing, charges mysteriously dropped. Peters has friends in high places, Barnes. Naomi clenched her jaw. The corruption ran deep, and it was more widespread than she had initially thought. This wasn't just about one rogue cop. It was about an entire system that allowed men like Peters to thrive. And now that she had pulled the thread, everything was beginning to unravel. We need to get into Marshall's office, Naomi said, her mind already calculating the next steps. There's no way he doesn't have some kind of paper trail connecting him to this mess. If we can prove he's been covering for Peters, we can bring the whole operation down. Clark nodded in agreement. Already in motion. We've got a team on it, pulling records and securing his office. But Barnes, he paused, his face serious. This is going to get ugly. If Marshall's involved, and we start pulling in people from the DA's office, we're talking about taking on some powerful players. This is more than just a precinct problem. It's a citywide issue. Naomi met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. I know what's at stake, Clark. But we can't let this slide. Not after what we've seen tonight. Clark studied her for a moment, then nodded again. All right, let's get to work. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Naomi, Clark, and their team worked through the night, reviewing records, interviewing officers, and piecing together the web of corruption that had allowed Peters to operate unchecked for so long. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered, and what they found was far worse than even Naomi had imagined. By early morning, they had gathered enough evidence to confirm what Naomi had suspected all along. Captain Marshall had been complicit in Peters' actions for years, covering up complaints, suppressing investigations, and using his influence to protect Peters from any real consequences. But that wasn't all. They also found links to other officers, several judges, and even officials in the DA's office who had helped bury cases that should have landed Peters behind bars long ago. Naomi sat at a table, reviewing a file that had just come in. It contained a series of internal emails between Marshall and a local district attorney, detailing how they had coordinated to drop charges against Peters in multiple cases involving accusations of excessive force and racial profiling. The language was coded, but the intent was clear. They had been protecting Peters for years, ensuring that he could continue his reign of terror without fear of retribution. She flipped to another document, this one a report from a whistleblower inside the precinct. The officer, who had requested anonymity, had detailed numerous instances where Peters had been caught fabricating evidence, coercing confessions, and intimidating witnesses. Each time, the cases had been quietly dismissed, thanks to Marshall's intervention. Naomi's blood boiled as she read through the report. This wasn't just corruption, it was systemic rot. The entire structure was compromised, and it was going to take more than just Peters' arrest to clean it up. Clark approached her, holding a thick folder of additional files. His face was grim. "It's worse than we thought," he said, dropping the folder on the table. "We've got evidence that Peters wasn't just harassing people, he was running a protection racket. Businesses in the area were paying him off to look the other way on illegal activity. Drugs, money laundering, even trafficking. And Marshall was getting a cut of the profits." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Peters hadn't just been abusing his power as a cop. He had been operating as a criminal kingpin, and the people who were supposed to hold him accountable had been helping him the entire time. "We need to go public with this," Naomi said, her voice firm. "We can't just handle this internally. The people need to know how deep this goes. They need to see that the system is broken and that we're going to fix it." Clark nodded, but his expression was hesitant. "It's not going to be easy, Barnes. We're talking about taking on some very powerful people. There's going to be backlash, and it's not just going to be from inside the precinct. Once this goes public, there's no telling how far the ripples will spread." Naomi understood the risks. Exposing this kind of corruption wasn't just about taking down a few bad cops. It was about challenging an entire system that had been built on protecting the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. But she also knew that they couldn't back down now. Too many people had suffered, too many lives had been destroyed, and the time for silence was over. "We need to do it anyway," Naomi said firmly. "The truth has to come out, no matter the cost." By midday, the press conference had been called. Reporters gathered outside the precinct, their cameras aimed at the podium where Naomi, Clark, and a few other key members of the FBI stood. The media had caught wind of Peters' arrest, but they had no idea just how deep the scandal went. That was about to change. Naomi stood in front of the cameras, her face calm but resolute. She knew that what she was about to say would change everything. The city would be rocked by the revelations, and powerful people would fall. But it was the right thing to do. She took a deep breath and began. "Today, we have taken the first steps toward dismantling the deeply rooted system of corruption that has plagued this city for years. Officer Jake Peters has been arrested on charges of unlawful detention, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. But this is just the beginning." The crowd of reporters leaned in, their pens poised over notebooks, their cameras clicking. Naomi continued, her voice strong and unwavering. "Our investigation has uncovered widespread corruption within this precinct, involving high-ranking officers, members of the district attorney's office, and local judges. These individuals have worked together to cover up crimes, protect corrupt officers, and profit from illegal activities." The flash of cameras intensified as Naomi laid out the details. She could feel the weight of what she was doing, but she didn't falter. The truth was more important than the fear of retribution. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice rising. "This is not just about one bad cop. This is about a system that has allowed people in power to abuse their authority and exploit the vulnerable. We are committed to dismantling this system and holding every person involved accountable, no matter their rank or position." As Naomi spoke, she could see the ripple effect beginning to take hold. This was more than just an arrest. It was the start of a reckoning, the aftermath, and the battle for justice. The press conference had sent shockwaves through the city. Naomi's words echoed across news outlets, social media, and the public consciousness, igniting a firestorm of reactions. The truth about Officer Jake Peters and the corruption that had been festering in the shadows for years was now exposed for all to see. But the fight was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Naomi sat in her office, the soft glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. On her desk were stacks of documents, files from the investigation, evidence collected from Peters' arrest, and the names of those who had helped him build his empire of abuse. The room was quiet, but Naomi could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. Outside her office door, the rest of her team was hard at work. Agent Clark had been coordinating with federal prosecutors, preparing charges against not only Peters, but also Captain John Marshall and several others implicated in the scandal. Naomi knew that they were about to face immense pressure from powerful people who wanted this whole thing buried, but she wasn't about to back down. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice steady but tired. The door creaked open, and Agent Clark stepped inside, a grim expression on his face. "Barnes, we've got a problem." Naomi looked up, her eyes narrowing. What kind of problem? Clark crossed the room and sat down across from her, dropping a thick folder onto her desk. "There's been a leak." Naomi's heart sank, but she didn't show it. She had expected this. The moment they exposed the depth of the corruption, the backlash was inevitable. What kind of leak? Clark opened the folder, revealing a series of printed articles and social media posts. Someone's been feeding information to the press, but not the whole story. They're twisting it, making it look like you're leading a vendetta against the police department, claiming you're targeting good officers out of some personal grudge. Naomi's jaw tightened. The old playbook. When the powerful are threatened, they try to discredit the truth-tellers. She had been prepared for this, but it still stung. Clark continued, his voice low. "There's already talk about a lawsuit from Peter's family, claiming wrongful arrest. Marshall's lawyer is putting out statements saying the captain had no knowledge of Peter's actions and that this is all a politically motivated witch hunt. And there are rumors that some officers in the precinct are organizing a walkout in protest of your investigation." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the implications. The city was being split down the middle, those who wanted accountability and justice, and those who were desperate to preserve the old order, where officers like Peters could act with impunity. This was no longer just a fight within the precinct. It was a battle for the soul of the city. "Let them walk out," Naomi said, her voice steady but firm. "If they're standing with Peters and Marshall, they're part of the problem, not the solution." Clark nodded, but the concern in his eyes didn't fade. "It's not just that," he said, lowering his voice. "We've also received credible threats against you." Naomi's eyes darkened, but she wasn't surprised. "What kind of threats?" Clark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Anonymous messages, calls. Some saying they're going to make sure you pay for what you've done. Others suggesting you should back off before it's too late. We're increasing security, but I wanted you to know. They're trying to intimidate you, trying to make you second-guess yourself." Naomi's expression hardened. She had expected the threats, the backlash, the attempts to silence her. She had seen it before. But this time, it wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who had been victimized by Peters and his allies, people whose voices had been silenced for far too long. Backing down wasn't an option. "I'm not going anywhere, Clark," she said, her voice firm. "We've come too far to stop now. If anything, these threats mean we're on the right track." Clark gave her a small nod, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "I figured you'd say that," he said, standing up. "Just keep your head on a swivel, all right? We're going to be walking into a storm." Naomi smiled faintly, though the tension in the room remained thick. "I've weathered storms before. We'll get through this one too." The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal battles, public opinion wars, and mounting tension within the precinct. The investigation had uncovered more than anyone had expected. Captain Marshall, once seen as a model of integrity, was revealed to be deeply involved in Peter's schemes. Evidence of his involvement in multiple cover-ups, kickback schemes, and even ties to organized crime came to light, shaking the foundation of the police department. Naomi's team worked tirelessly, combing through every piece of evidence, building airtight cases against those who had aided Peters. Each new revelation sent shockwaves through the city, further dividing the public. Protests erupted outside the precinct, some demanding justice and reform, while others stood in support of the police, convinced that Naomi's investigation was an attack on law enforcement as a whole. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was even more volatile. Many officers had turned against Naomi and her team, refusing to cooperate with the investigation. The thin blue line that had protected Peters for years was now cracking under the weight of the truth, But there were still those who clung to the old ways, unwilling to accept that the system they had served was corrupt to its core. One afternoon, as Naomi was preparing to head into a meeting with federal prosecutors, she received a message from an unexpected source. Officer Richards, the same man who had helped her expose Peters, was now requesting a private meeting. Naomi hesitated, unsure of what he could want, but something told her that this conversation could be important. Naomi met Richards at a small coffee shop far from the precinct. The air outside was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that foreshadowed the coming of winter. Richards sat at a corner table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his face drawn with stress and exhaustion. Naomi approached cautiously, sitting across from him. "Richards," she greeted, her voice neutral. "You wanted to talk." Richards nodded, though he didn't meet her eyes right away. He looked like a man weighed down by a heavy burden, one he wasn't sure how to lift. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." Naomi waited, giving him the space to speak. She could tell he was struggling with something. "I don't know how to say this," Richards continued, his eyes finally meeting hers. "But I need to come clean. There's more than you know about what was going on with Peters and Marshall." Naomi's interest peaked, though she kept her expression neutral. "Go on." Richards took a deep breath, his hand shaking slightly as he set down his coffee. Marshall wasn't just covering for Peters. He was running things behind the scenes. Peters was just his enforcer. Marshall had connections to local gangs, drug dealers, even a few city officials. They were all in on it. Money laundering, bribery, extortion. It was a whole operation, bigger than just the precinct. "And his voice faltered. Naomi's heart pounded. This was it, the deeper corruption she had suspected. But hearing it confirmed by someone who had been on the inside was both shocking and infuriating. "And you?" Naomi pressed gently. Richards looked away, guilt etched into every line of his face. "I knew," he admitted quietly. "Not all of it, but enough. I turned a blind eye because I didn't want to get involved. I was scared of what would happen if I spoke out. And now I'm in too deep. But I can't stay silent anymore." Naomi's eyes softened slightly. "You're doing the right thing, Richards," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's never too late to do the right thing. But we're going to need more than just your word. If you're ready to come forward, you'll need to testify, provide evidence." Richards nodded, though he looked terrified. "I'll do it," he said, his voice shaking. "I'll give you everything I know. I just need to know that when this is over, it'll be worth it. That we're really going to bring these guys down." Naomi leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I promise you, Richards, we're going to bring them down. All of them." The days that followed were a blur of intense preparation. With Richards' testimony, Naomi and her team now had the missing pieces they needed to go after Marshall and the broader network of corruption. It was a massive operation, involving federal prosecutors, the FBI, and even the Department of Justice. The city braced for the fallout as Naomi's investigation expanded, implicating more officers, city officials, and business leaders. The trial of Jake Peters was the first domino to fall. His conviction was swift, but it was just the beginning. Captain John Marshall, once untouchable, was arrested on charges of corruption, racketeering, and conspiracy, sending shockwaves through the city. One by one, the walls of the corrupt system began to crumble. Naomi stood outside the courthouse on the day of Marshall's sentencing, the cold wind biting at her skin. She watched as he was led away in handcuffs, his face pale, his eyes empty. The crowd outside erupted in cheers, but Naomi didn't feel the need to celebrate. This wasn't the end. There was still much work to be done. But it was a victory, a hard-fought one. And for that, she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. Clark approached her, a rare smile on his face. "You did it, Barnes," he said, clapping her on the shoulder. "You brought them all down." Naomi nodded, though her mind was already on the next challenge. "We did it," she corrected. "But this is just the beginning. We've exposed the rot, but now we need to rebuild." Clark smiled knowingly. "Always thinking ahead, aren't you?" Naomi allowed herself a small smile in return. "Someone has to." As the sun began to set on the courthouse steps, Naomi took a deep breath. The battle for justice was far from over, but she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. The city had been broken, but now, finally, it had a chance to heal. And Naomi Barnes was going to make sure it did. The end.